So just to give a history of my experience with Soulsborne from Software games, I've beat every Dark Souls game, and prior to this review I'd also beat Elden Ring when it originally came out. I've also played both Sekiro and Bloodborne, but I haven't had the time to explicitly finish either of them at this time. I would like to go back at some point in the future, but right now we're here to talk about Elden Ring. I've also beat Demon's Souls Remake for the PS5, but that was obviously done by Bluepoint and not From Software. From Software Souls games are some of my favorite games of all time. I can already tell this is going to be a long video, so I'm relying on you to understand what I mean by Soulsborne series games on a basic level. If you don't, I'll just give you a quick summary. They're essentially a series of action RPG games that are prided on their difficulty, boss fights, level design, and many other aspects of the game. As a quick preview, I think Elden Ring is the favorite one for me I've played. I can't say that of all time because of the fact that I haven't beat Sekiro or Bloodborne to the same level, and this review will actually encompass both Elden Ring's base game and the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion. It's an expansion more than a DLC. I'll have a whole section on it and I'll talk about different stuff, the differences between Shadow of the Erdtree open world, for example, and Elden Ring's base game open world and other aspects. I'll try to keep these reviews as separate as possible, so there will be one conclusion at the end. These reviews are essentially 2 in 1, so that's why it's taken a long time to get this out, so sorry for that. And I will say that this review was written, as I've heard recently that the final boss of Shadow of the Erdtree has been nerfed. This review was made literally right after I beat Shadow of the Erdtree, which was sometime, I believe, July, I think, if I remember correctly, July, August time, so bear that in mind as well. Also, for the sake of time, for me not being as experienced, I won't talk about the co-op aspects or the PvP aspects of Elden Ring. I know how important these parts are for From Software games and essentially are the end game if you really beat the main story, and a lot of people like to do the multiplayer stuff. That really isn't for me, so I don't choose to engage with it as much. So as a consequence of that, I can't really talk about it in detail. And also, as I was saying, with the Shadow of the Erdtree review and the Elden Ring base game review, I'll try not to use footage of Shadow of the Erdtree in the base game Elden Ring review and vice versa, just for, clarity's sake about what I'm talking about, and of course for spoiler's sake. I don't want to share the final boss of Shadow of the Erdtree while I'm talking about the Elden Ring base game story, for example. But without further delay, let's get into the specific aspects. Also, obviously, disclaimer, I played Shadow of the Erdtree and Elden Ring, the base game, the Xbox Series X, and we'll be talking about in the context of me doing so. Any performance or glitch issues may differ to others, and I'll try to indicate when I took spoilers, but beware that footage may be considered spoiler heavy. So to start with the base aesthetic of the game, while this game is very expansive and it includes a bunch of different locations, characters, enemies, etc., it's safe to say that Elden Ring has a similar style to the Dark Souls series that From Software also created, more than any other game they've made otherwise. This means, like Dark Souls, Elden Ring has this very European fantasy aesthetic with knights, castles, classical European depictions of dragons, etc. However, as I said, I don't believe European fantasy to be the only influence, of course, as it's known that From Software is a studio based in Japan. So one other huge notable reference or inspiration that can be seen in multiple places throughout Elden Ring is the popular manga Berserk. References to Berserk can clearly be seen throughout the Souls series in general. It's safe to assume that the creator of the Soulsborne series, Hidetaka Miyazaki, biggest influences when crafting these experiences is this manga. Blade, for example, is a clear reference to Guts, who is the main character of Berserk, for those who don't know. In the DLC, there's another clear-cut character that has a reference to Guts. Overall, bizarre, strange enemy designs in Elden Ring can also be said to be influenced by Berserk's grotesque monstrosities that you may see throughout the manga. The enemies in Souls have always looked more strange. Of course, you have the regular knights in different armors, undead monstrosities, gargoyles, and other things that we'd expect in a basic European fantasy setting. But you also have snake men, for example. You have demi-humans, you have living jars, and many more unique enemy types. I think have a more Berserk-like aesthetic, and even one can argue some of them have a more Japanese style when it comes to how certain enemies are designed for the world. And of course you can say there are more tertiary references to the aesthetic. When you can talk about Norse mythology, there's definitely some inspiration there. When you talk about stuff like Valkyries, you can talk about stuff like the Erdtree being a parallel or reference to Yggdrasil, which is the world tree that exists in Norse mythology. The reason I call these references or inspirations more tertiary than primary is because I feel like Berserk and European or Western fantasy is more primary, because we can see stuff like the Erdtree being a reference to the World Tree or Yggdrasil in Norse mythology, but there's other stuff like the World Tree in Berserk, if I remember correctly, which is 100% a reference to the Norse mythology, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Hidetaka Miyazaki chose the Erdtree because of Norse mythology. It might be because he saw it in Berserk, or somebody saw it in Berserk. There's a whole bunch of reasons why they could have done it, but that's why I call it more tertiary than primary. Other than that, there are some looser references when it comes to other mythologies and inspirations. Of course, in smaller places you'll find katanas, samurai armors, and other types of equipment that's not clearly inspired by Western fantasy, but let's not get too deep into the weeds at this point of different mythologies and all that. It could also go without saying that if you'd played other From Software games, Elden Ring clearly has those dark fantasy elements as well, with castles which can be described as having gothic architecture and how they're designed. Of course, I've mentioned many times in this section Berserk inspiration, but this also leads to the overall tone and vibe of Berserk being transferred, to which that is a very gritty and dark tone that many fans of From Software games continue to appreciate. When it comes to the way aesthetic builds an atmosphere, I feel that everything in Elden Ring when it comes to that comes together perfectly. We'll talk about it in a moment, but Elden Ring is an open world game, which is not how other From Software games have been in the past. I would describe them as more of a wide linear experience. If those of you who've seen my video about what's the difference between wide linear, and open world games, go check that out if you haven't checked out already. Snakes in the grass. But they've been more of a wide linear experience in the past, where you can go back and forth between different areas you finished, and the world's very interconnected. The way the different open world areas and aesthetic are combined to create how the game is presented on another level to me. Even if the graphical quality isn't up to the max, which is fine, the silent calm of just riding Torrent, which is your mount in the game, through foggy swamps, through icy tundra, volcanic hellscapes, etc., really adds to the experience, without talking too much about the open world itself, since its section is next. So as I've said previously, Elden Ring is an open world game, and to add to that, it's a very well done open world game. I may be forgetting, but I don't think I've experienced a better open world when it comes to the exploration, the incentive to find other different pieces of side content, and there's different stuff you can find by looking in the distance and seeing something briefly that catches your interest. I've not really experienced that since Skyrim, which is a huge compliment to Elden Ring, since I told you how much I hold Bethesda's open worlds in high regard. I'll get into why I love Elden Ring's open world so much in a minute. Before that, I have to warn you of spoilers of different areas I'm going to talk here. If you don't like that, skip to the timestamp on screen now. Okay, with that out of the way, I do have to say I've never been as shocked to see a game's open world or map open up as much as Elden Ring did in terms of how much bigger it was. Even first when looking at Limgrave, which is a pretty sizable zone or map at first. When I first jumped into Elden Ring, I wasn't prepared for how huge the map would actually be. What Elden Ring does a few times is that it shows this off and flexes its world in a way that is to include these little trap chests which teleport you to completely different areas of the map and shows you where they're located. For example, there's a chest in Limgrave that takes you all the way to Caelid. For those of you who know, there's a chest that takes you all the way to the royal capital, which is on the other side of the map. And when these chests take you there, you go to these locations. Even with normal teleporters, you can see the grayed out new section of the map. It really shocked me every single time the game did this, and you see like you're all the way on the other side of the whole map, and it just shocked me to see how the game opened up just from me exploring. I also can't neglect to mention my shock when I found out not only did From Software make a huge overworld for the player to go around and explore, they also created the whole underground map for the player to find different sections of, like Mogwin's Palace, Siofra River, Incel River, sorry if I'm getting that wrong, Lake of Rot, etc. These add different contexts to the overworld counterparts as well, like the deep root depth. It may seem obvious, but if you actually look, you're directly under the Erdtree when you're in that location. Not just the underground worlds too. From Software also created just completely optional, in some cases hidden areas like the Tree or the consecrated snowfields that you need to do specific quest lines to do that people may have missed. Now that's just talking about how the open world or how the world opens up, but the actual exploration is also amazing. You could find a whole range of, as I said, hidden areas. You can find NPCs that have whole quest lines related to them, which can lead to vastly differing endings for the game. There's also smaller dungeons that you can find, which could be different types of mines, caves, catacombs, etc. Do have their own boss at the end, which I have a bit of critique on that, but I'll go more into that critique in the boss section, what I think about the open world dungeon bosses. There's also overworld bosses as well, some that only show up at night, or some that are invading enemies, which may be difficult enough to actually give you some trouble depending on your skill level. Now there may be people who take issue with Elden Ring's approach to open world in comparison to classic Souls game, and I 100% understand why they would feel that way. Either it's because of the issue that you're missing an area and then you go to it and then you're over leveled for that area. Let's say you miss an area early on and then you realize that area is there, and then you go to it and then you're completely over leveled and it's a complete joke. And I can understand that feeling because in my first playthrough I literally experienced this. I defeated Radahn before I defeated the Lionine Misbegotten in area that's just south of Limgrave. I need to remember that. When I actually went ahead and found that waste later on, it was a complete joke and I completely missed out on that area because there's no challenge to it. It's easy, not fun to be honest, to go through. Stuff like this is much more likely to happen if you don't use some sort of area guide. Consequence, of course, of using an area guide is it gets rid of the wonderment of going out and exploring the world and finding these areas. There may be people who also oppose Elden Ring's open world decision because of the issue that happened on the second half of Dark Souls 1 with the Four Kings, Tree of Chaos, and Nito. The game doesn't know which order you're going to fight these bosses in, so the first one you fight will be the most difficult, and then onwards as you go through the different areas, each boss will be easier and easier and easier, and the last might just be a complete joke as well. This isn't as bad as in Elden Ring because you can make a convincing argument that it does exist just from the non-linear nature of the experience, and also of course there may just people who don't like open world games. Completely fair. I would push back on a lot of these ideas that some may present, like the perceived issue that bosses will get easier. Of course they will, but I think the open world being the way it is more of a strength than a weakness. I will talk about difficulty in a separate section, but I think that the fact that you can go and do different content like side bosses in dungeons, or go do some ruins and then go to a completely different area which is more close to your level or under your level if you're stuck on a boss, which is also what had allowed so many people to go ahead and really enjoy Elden Ring and experience it in comparison to Dark Souls. I have to say, the numbers don't lie. 25 million people have bought Elden Ring. Almost half of that had bought Dark Souls 3, and who knows how many played that beyond just beating Eudex Gunde. As I said, I'll get into the difficulty conversation later, but anyone at this point who is complaining about Elden Ring being too hard or needing an easy mode has either not even played the game or on that level of understanding, or is deliberately ignoring the tools that From Software have put in the game to allow them to customize the difficulty. To quickly mention, environmental storytelling has always been in Souls games. It's a big part of how the player is supposed to understand the story. I'll go into more detail in the story section of course, but I felt it was good to mention environmental storytelling throughout Elden Ring's open world is phenomenal. I think there's probably some of it is some of the best From Software has done. As I mentioned before as well, interconnectedness is a vital part of From Software games. The open world of Elden Ring has a lot in it. I don't feel like it has the same level of interconnectedness as Dark Souls 1. More just talking about the open world of Elden Ring's interconnectedness. The legacy dungeons of Elden Ring I feel like are much more closer to filling the role than the open world itself. This is something that I actually like. Should make the world feel more expansive, and I can tell you it's very difficult to have any type of interconnectedness in a world when you have an expansive map or you have a bigger map as Elden Ring does. And they do manage in a lot of cases to connect the world in different parts of the world. I feel like they do it a lot better in the legacy dungeons, which are supposed to fill that role of the areas of the Dark Souls games and the other games in the Souls series. So as I said before, there are aspects of previous Souls games that do carry over here when it comes to legacy dungeons. Now, what is a legacy dungeon? It's what you could expect from your classical Dark Souls dungeon or area done in Elden Ring, essentially. Everything you could typically expect from a level in Dark Souls, you can also typically expect to see in a legacy dungeon. There's quite a few depending on what you classify as a legacy dungeon. I'm going to play it safe and say that there's 6 main legacy dungeons. The more expansive and extensive ones are Stormveil Castle, Volcano Manor, etc. But then there are a few structural similarities in terms of design wise with legacy dungeons, but they're much more small in scale, such as Castle Sol or Redmane Castle or even Korea Manor could fall into this category. One aspect that is consistent is not allowing you to mount in a legacy dungeon. This is done to not ruin the experience that they've crafted specifically for these dungeons. There are many times where you could theoretically skip or do something to avoid something in a legacy dungeon if you had access to torrent in that moment, which would just skew the intention or not really allow you to enjoy the game in a classical linear Souls manner which they would want you to. For example, you could see a purple item on a faraway ledge. Your first instinct may be to scout out the area nearby, see that maybe there's a way to get to there, look around a bit, see if there's a key to get to a gate or something like that around the area. Whereas if you had something like torrent where you could just jump over the ledge, then all the actual level design that From Software wants you to go through has gone to waste. Another aspect that I like is consistent across linear Souls games, and something that Legacy Dungeons do well in would be the deliberate verticality that is done in Legacy Dungeons in comparison to being in the open world. Don't get me wrong, there is a lot of verticality and depth to the open world, but the thing is that you have torrent to elevate and ensure that any actual change to the gameplay by the verticality isn't going to be any substantial. What I mean is advantages that the player or enemies have by being on a ledge and shooting at the player, or signposting in a way to show that the player should be able to find a way up, around, and to that enemy, and or vice versa. The player seeing an enemy below that they could easily kill then leads them to another area, which expands the overall depth of the dungeon. Combining verticality and then also the interconnectedness makes the Legacy Dungeons feel more similar to the experience in linear Souls games that fans of those games than probably the base game would, which is much more unfamiliar territory. In my opinion, I think Stormveil Castle and Volcano Manor are some of the best examples of these aspects that Elden Ring provides. Stormveil Castle, nearly everywhere you see you can go to. The battlements on the top of the towers, to the basements, to the inside of the castle, inside of the church rooms, the dining rooms. To the first decision you have to make from climbing in from the side or going through the front entrance, you really feel the different levels and verticality to this dungeon, and it's a really familiar feeling for me for Undead Burg from Dark Souls 1, for example. Of course, with that verticality, there is different interconnected areas going from the castle to the side entrance to more of an inside area to on top of the roofs to the ramparts. Everything in spirit is there, including hidden areas in the basement people could completely miss if they didn't go through a certain route to unlock a certain door. That's the thing about interconnectedness. It's not just about shortcuts back and forth to make it easier. It's really more to do with seeing an area and going through and finding a door and knowing 3 hours later that you're gonna find a way to unlock that door and find out where it goes to. Or that relief when finding a site of grace after going through a tough area and finding the previous locked door that you can now open. I'm talking more about Volcano Manor as an example, since that is more fresh and later on in the game to me. First of all, you have the different ways to get into a Volcano Manor, from Mount Gelmir, from the Ria's invitation to going there yourself, Raya Lucina Academy enemy teleport there, and then there's the actual inside of the manor, which they have different top bridge parts, and then you can go lower to the town-like parts, and then at the very bottom you're traversing the rooftops to the half submerged in lava buildings, to the different caves and mountain legends, since Volcano Manor obviously is in the volcano itself. Then there's the church part with the Godskin Noble, and which acts as a little mini boss. Also, you can't forget the classical environmental aspect in all Legacy Dungeons. There's ample opportunity to get knocked off an edge and die. In Volcano Manor there's less of that, more of you having to worry about the lava killing you and you having to worry about that more. These two Legacy Dungeons also have that branching off aspect. The different sections you have the choice to go to that may have you reach your same goal or path in the end. Now, onto some negative aspects. I do feel Legacy Dungeons have is the simple fact that these are sectioned off areas that are intended to be these Legacy Dungeons in the first place. It makes them feel smaller in the grand scheme of the game or the world in comparison to any real area of a Souls game. They're much shorter, and as a categorical fact in comparison to other Souls areas in different games, and I never felt a Legacy Dungeon or an area giving me the same feeling as Anor Londo for the first time, or even Sen's Fortress. I felt was more expansive in a lot of aspects to the main Legacy Dungeons in Elden Ring even. These problems are even worse in the smaller Legacy Dungeons. This may be an unpopular or bad take. The only Legacy Dungeon I felt really could match some of the Souls areas was the Erdtree, which is an optional one in the first place. It's also separated off from the actual world. You can't see the Erdtree from the outside, I'm pretty sure, at least, and it's very much its own thing that you teleport and do. But at the same time, it's much more linear to a dungeon as in comparison to smaller ones like Raya Lucina Academy or even Stormveil. You basically have the one goal to get to the bottom of the tree, and while there are times where you find an elevator to take you back to a site of grace, I really didn't feel that same level of interconnectivity. But that might just be my nostalgia speaking from the older games, so I might be wrong. So give some feedback in the comments about how you felt about how long the Legacy Dungeons were and their role in the game, if you felt they could be utilized better or there could be more in the base game. Another thing that makes me feel all of them are a bit worse is that there isn't really unique enemies to these Legacy Dungeons apart from the main boss. A lot of them are, for me, felt like maybe that going through a second playthrough, a lot of them felt like a race to get to Godric or Ranala. Rhea Lucina felt like a much smaller dungeon going through my second time, but that might be just me going through it a second time. It just felt way smaller. Now, you could make many arguments that areas like Anor Londo only really had Ornstein and Smo as the dual boss, besides Gwendolyn later on, but the area around Anor Londo, the City of Sunlight, so much more to it beyond the boss, with different quest lines going on. There's different conclusions to different pathways and side areas that really made you feel like you weren't just there to kill Ornstein and Smo as your quickest only objective in the whole area. And note, as I'm not talking about the DLC Legacy Dungeons, as that is a different section later on, and I have more to say on them. Now, I'm not saying Legacy Dungeons are bad. That's nothing close to what I'm saying, actually. I enjoyed each one quite a bit, and the unique designs and themes and the lore behind each one, how they fit into the bosses for who they were and what they're meant to be. I just wish there was more to them in comparison to what they were supposed to represent or fill the role of. Now, since Elden Ring is an action RPG, of course there's quite a few RPG systems all at once to enhance the role-playing in the game. I'll save the choice and consequence and the questline related RPG elements for the questline sections. So this section will be mainly focused on your character and what you can really do to make your character feel like your own. Now, when it came to both my playthroughs, to be honest, in every Souls game, I've never gone for a magic build because that's not my style. People like it, I know it's easier, but I prefer to go in with a short sword and shield or a huge great sword to meet bosses in combat face to face. So in my first playthrough, I had a dexterity focused build with a katana and a shield. In my second playthrough, I played around with a few different ideas. Ultimately, I focused on a more pure strength build with a great sword. Now, when it comes to stats that you can level up, there's stuff that every character should have some points in, like vigor, which increases your health, but then there's stuff that you really should focus on, and it's really more open than some of the previous Souls games, but not largely transformative. You could make the argument, since Elden Ring is a much larger game, that it can make going after different builds, different sequential playthroughs, more of an issue, because it's a much longer game. For example, Dark Souls 3 only took me personally 25 hours to beat my first time. My first Elden Ring playthrough, in comparison, was 99 hours, and my second one was 108 hours. So this is an argument that you can kind of use against the idea of Elden Ring being more open than other Souls games, which are just more shorter experiences. However, I would push back a bit, saying that Elden Ring not only is an open world and you can basically go wherever you want, get most weapons that you want if you so desire, but the player can also completely respec their character as soon as the second legacy dungeon, which in other Souls games it isn't even possible in other Souls games to respec into either way. Like the case of Dark Souls 3, it's really hard to respec. It's not even possible in Dark Souls 1 to respec. For those who don't know, respecing is essentially reallocating your stat points to be able basically to change up your build after you've already allocated them if you feel like you've messed up your character or you're just not really enjoying your current build. As soon as you get to Rhea Lucina, you can respec and really start experimenting if you so choose. On that note, I maybe should have started with this, but in Elden Ring you do create your own character. In comparison to something like Sekiro, which you have a character given to you at the beginning, you are given the choice of starting classes. This only really matters for your starting stats and gear really early into the game. Basically any other time later you will be doing basically anything you want to choose to do in terms of a combination of respecing your stats and the sheer amount of levels you get later on. Now, speaking on magic as an option, as I've said, I've never really played magic as a playstyle in any Souls game that I've engaged with, but I can even tell that this game really allows you for more build diversity and mix match type of builds where you don't need to be fully magic based in your playthrough. You can have some magic, you can have some melee, a wide variety of spells and incantations that the player can also engage with and incorporate into your playstyle. And there's different bases of magic, which with a lot of stats scaling with magic, such as intelligence, arcane, faith, all that magic based stats and dedicated to magic, and the different types of spells that you can get, such as sorceries, dragon communion, and incantations, of course. I would like to go into more detail, but again, I've never really engaged with this playstyle from any From Software game, so it's hard to me to really compare magic now to magic in Dark Souls 1, for example. Now, moving on to weapon upgrades, as a small aside, always liked how in Souls games you do have the option to basically revolve your whole playthrough around a single weapon, or have the option to carry out a weapon throughout a whole game and have it be viable and actually beat bosses. I remember I used the Uchigatana basically the whole of my Dark Souls 1 first time through, and for Dark Souls 3 I used the standard broadsword for the vast majority of the game. One aspect that allows you to do this is the ability to upgrade your weapons and weapon and how much of a difference doing so can make. Upgrading your weapons at the blacksmith can make a huge noticeable difference in your damage, even more so than leveling, which has a variety of different soft caps and different things that may make it so that it wouldn't be as blunt to you that you're stronger. Also, the weapon upgrades are paced enough so you can't be incredibly overpowered at the beginning due to you needing the upgrade materials at the beginning, which you may be able to find a few at a certain point, but from my understanding you will need to progress somewhat to different areas if you just have a stronger weapon in those areas, and severely underleveled. Most of the players which are severely underleveled wouldn't be able to do so. Obviously some can. But beyond weapon upgrades, a great segue is the Ashes of War system that really act as the final piece of the puzzle to really make a player's weapon theirs and really hold onto it throughout the playthrough and the journey. You see, in Souls games in the past, weapon arts have specifically been tied to certain weapons throughout the games. These could not be changed or have anything done with them. For those who don't know, a weapon art is basically a skill tied to a specific weapon in the game. Let's say, for example, you've had a really cool weapon that you liked the feeling of. It has a very, very bad weapon art. You would have to deal with that as a consequence and as a trade-off. In Elden Ring, they've added the Ashes of War system that allows the vast majority of weapons to have the weapon art changed through attaching an Ash of War to that weapon, allocates a new specific skill to that weapon. Now, there is some limitations of this within reason. You can't put, for example, a spear-based Ash of War on a great shield. I'm pretty sure it is something that allows for more build diversity within melee and other builds, as you can keep a weapon you still have. Now, there are some circumstances, I believe, like some unique weapons or boss weapons can't have Ashes of War altered on them at all, particularly with weapons that have a unique weapon art attached, which does make sense. Now, speaking of weapons and armor in general, obviously plays a huge role in your build. Actually choosing a weapon and picking out of these pieces for a set that matches your preferred build matters a lot in the grand scheme of the game. There's a lot of different weapon types, as I mentioned, spears to great shields to great swords to straight swords, focuses for magic to staffs to bows. The list goes on and on and on for the different weapons you have to choose from. An aspect that Souls games have always had is to use your weapon effectively, you have to be spec in using it for your stats. For example, I can't pick up a great sword with 40 strength when I have 9 strength, and I can't think that's going to be swung in the most effective way or even be nearly as useful as if I had my character spec'd in that way. Same thing can be said for armor. If you don't have the endurance, which affects your equip load and your stamina, then you'll get a heavy load and you'll be fat rolling everywhere, which for some people that may be cool for them, but to others it's very obtuse and a very rigid way of dealing with rolling. So it's something that you're going to want to manage over your playthrough, or what kinds of weapons and armor you're using, and even talismans can get you fat rolling. Now, speaking of talismans, for those who have played Souls games before, they basically act as rings you'd get in those games. Truth be told, I prefer rings to talismans in design, but that's besides the point. Talismans are another way that the player can curate their build and their character. There's a huge variety of talismans. You can go from basic ones that increase a single stat or may increase the healing from your flask, for example, to ones that increase all relevant stats but have a huge risk to them, like increasing your damage that you take. Or there's other ones that increase your damage with successive hits, or other ones that allow you to heal from critical hits. You can have 4 talismans equipped in total by the end of the game if you get all the talisman pouches, which is basically upgrades for them. At the beginning, you are basically limited to a capacity of 1. One thing you can do is you can wear 4 talismans in comparison to previous Souls games, which only allowed you to wear 2 rings. But for me, it felt like rings were more powerful and more specialized for specific use cases. You weren't going to always need a specific ring, while a certain talisman could be a huge backbone for your whole build, but provide general useful effects like increasing arcane or increasing intelligence or equip load. That might not factually be true. I might be remembering, but that's how I felt in the game. Now, moving on to items and of course crafting too. There's a wide variety of consumable items the player can have access to, which allows them to buff or strengthen their character or even damage enemies or other unique effects. These always existed in Souls games, but they would be kind of limited in a way to play because you have a finite number of them that you could get in the world, or you'd have to spend your souls or farm them or get them in very specific ways if possible. In Elden Ring, they've added crafting, which for more of the general use items like the status effect curing ones are the most important of the general use, from just how much Miyazaki likes to use poison swamps. These items are more accessible to the player than ever. I remember a time in Dark Souls 1 when I had to get through Blight Town and it was an absolute hell because the items were so limited, and if you happen to die, you're basically out of luck, because in that point you have to farm back the souls at that point and go ahead and buy more to progress. If you compare Blighttown to the Lake of Rot as an extreme example perhaps, for me, Lake of Rot was a much easier experience to go through due to the types of items that you need to get through being more accessible to the player via crafting or just finding them easier. There is the aspect of crafting where you actually need to go out and find the cookbooks, and that is something that if you're struggling realistically, you can just search up where a cookbook is and then find the item you want online. Final thing guys that I do want to talk about here is summons. Now, do I really use summons that often, or do I try to? I don't try as a personal thing. I like the challenge of trying to do a boss alone. It feels better to me to do that to fight a boss in the normal circumstances. The only time I really use a summon is if I don't like a boss, or think it's a cheap boss, so I'll try to get it over with, or if there's some really annoying run back and I don't ever want to have to deal with this boss after a few tries. That's more of an issue in Dark Souls 2 and why I use summons in that game. In Elden Ring, the last reason I would use a summon is just for time's sake. I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I can't spend 3 or 4 days on a single boss. If I feel like I've got the mechanics down, it's just down to execution, then I'll summon. Those are just my personal reasons. If I do summon, of course no one needs to give an explanation or a defense for playing the game. Let's be real. I just feel like I just want to explain why and when I use summons, why I choose to do so as a player who doesn't typically. If you choose to engage with it for any reason, then that's your decision. It doesn't make your playthrough any less valid than others. I just like to explain why I, who doesn't typically like to summon, why I would under specific circumstances. But anyways, regarding summons, they've always been a part of From Software's Souls games, but in Elden Ring they really deepened the mechanic, and which is very cool for people who typically engage with it. You can basically summon in most places near a rebirth monument using spirit ashes, or summons for perhaps different characters and creatures that you've gone out and found the item for. Very similar to the Ashes of War system, where you have to go out and acquire the spirit ashes through specific means. Now, this doesn't get rid of the classical summons that you find near boss rooms through summon signs on the ground. That is still a present thing in Elden Ring. The special thing about spirit ashes is that you can level them up via spirit tuning, or which allows you to carry a summon throughout the whole game like you could a weapon. They basically act in the same way as a weapon upgrades as well to upgrade these different summons. Now this section is more focused on the regular enemies in Elden Ring, from the basic deer to the soldier to the mini boss enemies that may have been early on in your journey. I love how Elden Ring uses enemies throughout the open world sections to keep the player engaged. First thing I want to mention is the variety of enemies throughout the game. I do want to say that Elden Ring is a much larger game than any previous Souls game. May have made the enemy variety less apparent. Because of its size, you may be seeing a lot more of the same enemies, but factually speaking, this is deceiving, because Elden Ring has 126 enemy types from my understanding. That's nearly double the amount of Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, and Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne separately. Now, the enemies, they don't just vary in their skins and have just like a reskin. They do have reskins in the game, but it's not. There is different unique enemy types, such as undead knights to giant ants, to giant trolls, to bears, to undead crows, to dogs, to living hands. The list goes on and on and on. Different enemy distinct types that have different AI patterns and attack patterns. The game does challenge you to learn each one of these enemies' movesets, and especially for certain enemies, you will be punished if you do not adapt your playstyle and you try to defeat them just by face rolling them. There's stuff you just have to learn or pick up on later on that are more challenging enemies that you might struggle with. For example, the Revenant is constantly a challenging enemy from my first encounter with one to my last, because I didn't invest in things that would have made them easier. These things will really punish you if you roll backwards and are a hyper aggressive enemy. But with someone who has invested points into faith and had some healing spells, these things are incredibly weak. They're so weak. Casting certain healing spells will deal 50% of their health, basically making them much easier to kill in comparison to what I had to deal with. Kind of already spoken about enemy designs in the aesthetic section, but I really want to quickly emphasize that there are a lot of unique looking enemies. A lot of them are inspired by medieval Western fantasy, but a lot of them have strange, grotesque From Software style things that may confuse you at first sight. Now, I've mentioned this before, but I really do like it when From Software or any studio has a boss at around its same level of difficulty as a mini boss, or even a regular enemy you can fight later on. My only good moment in the underground section of Dark Souls 1 in the second half of the game was after Ceaseless Discharge going down and seeing a large group of Taurus demons. For those who don't know, was the first boss of Dark Souls 1. Having the ability to fight them and see how much stronger you've become as these bosses have just become regular enemies to you. Elden Ring does a lot of this with the Crucible Knights, boss, the Dragon Tree Sentinels, and something simple like the Demi-Human Chief becomes a 2-hit enemy for you later on in the game. Or the Beasts of Pharaoh Mazula, which you can fight early in the game, literally at the end of the game, they become a regular enemy type for you. Now, speaking of the open world execution of enemies, having enemies in the open world is much different to say having enemies in a regular Souls game, and it's one of the more difficult things to get right. In a linear game, it's a curated experience. You have to fight a certain enemy to get to a certain place. You can try to run past the enemy, but it will follow you, so be prepared to fight multiple of them. Because you could have a situation where you have multiple enemies chasing you down, this is experience that most of the time will happen in Elden Ring's Legacy Dungeon, but in the open world where you can very easily mount and get away, you can't really curate the experience in the same way, as you can't have enemies that chase you to the ends of the earth, because that could be chaotic. Imagine if you had 70 enemies all chasing the player, they could really mess up the game for them. So there's that argument that just having an open world may make it way less of a consistent curated experience. Now, I do like the patrols they have going around, but even that is something you don't need to engage with more than once to get the item in the carriage, so they're pointless to engage with after that. Some of the fights between different enemy types you could find that cool, but it's not really as an important focus. They're just cool to see happening. This is where a lot of the stuff I like to talk about comes in, because I want to talk about the bosses now in particular. And I felt that in Elden Ring there was a large variety of exceptional bosses, even for the Soul series. A lot of these bosses were one of the better ones they've ever made. I've saved my discussion for the DLC bosses in the DLC section, because I really want to discuss some of those. Now, to get into some of the specifics of course token bosses, we really have to get into the weeds when it comes to spoilers. So if you don't want to be spoiled, skip to the timestamp on screen again. So just to give quickly a list of some of my favorite bosses and why they were some of my favorite bosses, I'll give a top 5 here. Number 5, I would actually give it to Godric the Grafted. Actually, some may be surprised since he's pretty early on into the game. He's really the first one of the big bosses that you can defeat, so many people may just discount him as a fodder boss or like an easy boss, but I think he's actually a really good fight as a introductory fight to the Legacy Dungeon bosses. His design is really grotesque and bizarre. I think his lore is really cool, on the way he talks and the way he stands as that initial obstacle for the player to beat before the game really opens up. Of course, the fight itself is a decent challenge for the player early on. It has 2 phases. It's probably the first fight that the player will have to do that has 2 distinct phases, other than Crucible Knight if they haven't already defeated that. A really good fight in my opinion. Number 4, I would give it to Radagon, the final boss of the game, not counting the Elden Beast part, which can count as a phase 2 if you want to count it, but I really prefer just the first phase of Radagon in my opinion. I really like that fight, just the way the music and the way he walks down the player slowly and attacks like he does, the lore around him and how he and Marika are the same person. Beginning cutscene of the fight, you could really see how the Elden Ring is actually inside of him, or at least the blueprint or the backbone of the ring. Everything of how the fight is presented, how cool the fight is, it really reminds me of that classic Gwyn fight from Dark Souls 1. It's not the hardest fight in the game. It's something story-wise that is really necessary for player to understand and do. Number 3, I'll have to give it to Mohg, Lord of Blood. I really like how this was a boss you could find early on in the journey through Vare's questline, or literally at the end of the game if you go through the consecrated snowfields, which is a secret area that you wouldn't just find existence of if you just straight shot the main story of the game. The boss itself had some good presentation and is one of the harder bosses difficulty wise. I'd put him in the top 3 of the base game. I'd say maybe number 2 actually in difficulty. I really like how he forces you to pay attention to the area around you actively in the fight in the second phase, due to him using that fiery blood that will kill you if you're not paying attention to where you are. A good way to force the player to pay attention to the surroundings without putting in a second target or a second boss. That is another way to force you to pay attention to your surroundings. I think he's probably the only boss that actually ever filtered me completely when I initially fought him. Like, regardless if you do find him early, if you don't have all your flasks or you don't have up to maximum upgraded flasks, his second phase transition will completely filter you out, or the immediate fight after will completely filter you. Number 2 is Horolu or Godfrey. Honestly, when I talk about presentations of fights and the build up, I think only number 1 can really surpass Godfrey for me. You hear about Horolu literally at the beginning of the game. Throughout the game, you even fight the golden ghost version of Godfrey the first time in the royal capital on your way to Morgoth. Speaking of Morgoth, I think it's so cool how, respectful and regal Godfrey is. You walk in to the arena just as Morgoth dies, and he's holding Morgoth in his hands, which is my understanding is, I think he's one of Godfrey's sons. Please forgive me because I'm not that well versed in the lore of Elden Ring right now, and not as well as Dark Souls. And then really how the second phase
phase, he really reveals himself from Godfrey to Horalu. And it's not really out of hatred or desperation. He sees you worthy to not keep up a facade or keep in his weaker state as Godfrey. The way I took it is that out of respect for you and your power, he's allowing us to fight him in his prime as Horalu. It is also significant how his title switches from Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, which may be seen as something, crazy as the player is fighting someone that important to the story. There's some baggage there, since we're trying to be the Elden Lord. If that's, what the player is striving to be. But then the name changes as he fights you, or like the title changes to just Horalu, warrior, him forsaking the axe and literally fighting you hand-to-hand combat as the chieftain of the Badlands. And the respect that he gives you after the fight, saying such strength befits a crown. He's not crying, he's not bitter, he shows respect, and that's something I really like in a boss. And of course the actual fight itself is backed up in physical gameplay as well with its presentation. Of course, number one for me in the base game would be Star Scourge Radahn. It's literally my favorite fight in the whole of the base game. When I was talking about presentation, this Radahn fight really embodies that. He was in every trailer from the beginning of the marketing campaign, from the announcement to the actual final release launch trailer of the game. The build up to the fight, him having a whole festival of a bunch of NPCs around who you may know who are there to participate in the Radahn festival, putting him out of his misery since he's no longer in his prime. He in the lore is the strongest one out of the main bosses, if I remember correctly, but the version we fight, Star Scourge Radahn, has been degraded and rotted by the Scarlet Rot so much after his battle with Melania. He's very, very, like, in a much more weaker state than he usually is. He's got great arrows poking out of his back, he doesn't have legs, and he needs his horse to carry him around, or and his legs are scraping onto the ground and all that. Also mentally degraded to the point where he just roars and just eats corpses and all that kind of stuff. But despite that, his fight is not a mercy killing or where he's just wimping around. The whole fight itself is a marathon to defeat him. Even in the state he's in, you basically have to ride up to him, just from you being on the other side of the arena, him shooting magical gravity arrows or clusters of normal great arrows, and then when you get close enough to him, he pulls out his two swords and just starts swinging. And then of course the second half where he jumps into the air and does the meteor attack, of course, to start off phase 2. Really is one of the best fights when it comes to presentation, lore, mechanics. All around is my favorite fight in the base game, and anyone who's watched Snakes in the Grass, the intro of it, there's a reason why Radahn's in the number 1 place. Those are my top 5 bosses, just to give you an idea. Now moving on to things that I didn't like, but I understand why they have to do it. So in Souls games, there's 2 things that I really hate. One, reusing a boss in another fight, or even worse than that, instead of just reusing a boss, just copy pasting a boss, having 3 of the same boss that already appeared earlier in the game to artificially increase the difficulty. I find it very lazy and I find it very annoying, and it's one of the reasons I dislike Dark Souls 2 a lot. But I understand why Elden Ring does it, and why in minor dungeons that realistically people want to fight something at the end of that's interesting. Most people don't go through a whole dungeon just to fight nothing at the end of it, and I do appreciate that when they do reuse bosses in Elden Ring, they do like to add in a new mechanic to keep it more interesting. My issues stem from when they don't do that and they just copy paste the boss. For example, the Erdtree avatars. I really don't like this enemy in particular. I really think this one is the worst example, specifically because it reuses the skeleton and animations from the Asylum Demon in Dark Souls 1, which in that game was used 3 times. I already said in the enemy section, I like it when they reuse a boss as a mini boss or an enemy. That is different, reusing a boss as a boss. Again, in the end, I understand why they do it, but that doesn't mean I have to like it. I think now would be a good time to mention great runes. You get a great rune basically every time you defeat one of the most important bosses in the game. I do like how they've incorporated the divine towers where you go and unlock a great rune to unlock its power at the specific divine tower associated with it. One issue with them though is some of them aren't very good in my opinion in practice, or there's some good default choices that invalidate others. For example, I think Godric's great rune, until I got Radahn's for the whole rest of the game, ultimately a lot of them were pretty niche, and it was nice to have the choice, but the go-to Rycards or even Melanias were just never made for me. Now on to a semi-controversial discussion around the game, the difficulty around it, and others from Software Souls games for a lot of people could be stated to be too hard, punishing, etc. I've always completely disagreed with this notion, especially that the games need an easy mode, and in particular I think this argument is especially a useless or just blatantly pointless argument to have in the case of Elden Ring. Elden Ring is the most flexible Souls game from Software has ever made. It could be the hardest Soulsborne for a person, or it could be by far the easiest for others, depending on how you want to engage with the tools that the game gives you. Instead of straight up putting an easy mode in the game menu, which makes the game a complete joke for everyone, From Software has put tools into the game that objectively make the game less challenging. You are completely free to use then to allow you to play the game
if you can't handle the game without them, which is completely fine. I do want to highlight some of these tools quickly, just so people know what I'm talking about. If maybe you like Elden Ring and you find it difficult to get into, so you want to get into it without being too challenged, nothing against people who want that, but that's just to highlight some of the stuff. So some of these being historically available, that's From Software has put into the game, like a magic focused build or summons, which both are the most accessible and available to use in Elden Ring than in any other previous Souls game. The magic has clearly been an easier way and intended to be an easier way to get through the game, because you don't have to physically go to the bosses. Some bosses in Elden Ring do punish you for using magic though, so be aware of that, or some enemies, but that comes with the territory. It's not just those types of things. Naturally, over leveling or actually going to do other side content also in Elden Ring, apart from just farming souls in a small spot in previous games where you aren't really supposed to, this wasn't actively something that was available to do, but in Elden Ring it's basically an expectation that if you go to a boss you just can't do it. It's perfectly okay to go to a completely different direction, get stronger, come back later and beat that boss. It's also something that existed, but it's more accessible in Elden Ring, is co-op. While it is kind of a finicky thing to get up and starting, it's still a way that you can go ahead and defeat bosses easier, to call someone to help you out. There's a bunch of other things that, you could talk about, numerous other weapons or builds that you can use to completely make the game a joke to beat. This is just the reality of the situation, that even if there isn't a specific menu prompt that, reduces all the enemy's health to 1, or reduces, completely erases all the challenge for everyone, or reduces the boss's health, reduces the attack damage, etc. You can vary the difficulty yourself by doing things that I've said, and other things too that I haven't said, in the time to learn about these different paths. My underlying issue with how people discuss the difficulty is also comes off as them forcing From Software to do something that they clearly and actively stated that they don't want to do. Kind of flies in the face of all these people who say that we care about the creative vision of the team and what they want to do. If they did, then once Miyazaki said for the first time that why they don't want to do an easy mode, they would have stopped asking for it and stopped being weird about it. Now, story and lore, sorry, but I'm not really going to get into the intricacies of the lore and the story here. The fact is that when it comes to Elden Ring, it can be looked into, and the lore is just so much bigger than I could ever have time for in one video, fully discuss in depth. There's a whole breadth of channels that people can go watch to discuss, that are completely dedicated into looking through the intricacies of the lore, so I won't be really discussing with the story in a huge capacity in this section. From an analysis standpoint, as hours and hours of that already exists from other content creators that could discuss it better than I could have discussed it. I do want to talk about how much I love how From Software tells the story and presents the lore and the story that has kind of sprouted this collaborative effort to uncover how the world came to be, the story of the bosses, etc. They do this through a combination of masterclass environmental storytelling, presentation through item descriptions and scattered throughout the world, and the dialogue of the NPCs, who may act as unreliable narrators. I always like the use of the analogy of the broken mirror when it comes to From Software games. You have a mirror which is full, and that's essentially the whole story, and at this point you shatter it into 1,000 pieces. Each shard of the mirror could represent a small but important piece of the full picture of the story that may not make full sense until the full mirror. One aspect that some may appreciate is the non-linear nature to approaching the story, and the ambiguity that is left on the table a lot of times, that do allow different YouTubers or just theorists to come up with their own interpretations of what happened when they look through the story and look through different side content and quest lines that the game presents. Speaking of side content and quest lines, Elden Ring does have a few important ones that lead to different endings, or just different endings for certain characters. They do have some quest lines that lock you out of other quest lines, like Nefeli and Selva. They can't be done in the same playthrough. Rani's quest line is probably the longest from what I can tell in the game, and from what I can remember, that since it does lead to the Age of Stars ending and all new areas that you can't access without it, is also the quest line that leads to the Frenzied Flame ending, which is a hiatus quest line, which then also gets Shibiri involved. Those are just the two different big endings, and there's 4 whole side endings, which are basically variations of the base ending that depend on what quest lines you do, like Gold Mask's questline, Fia's questline, the Dung Eater's questline. Each of these questlines do very insignificant. I believe out of the other 3, I think Fia's is the longest out of the 3 separate lines. Then there are just side quests that you can just do a side quest, like Yura or Nefeli Lu or Kenneth Height or like Alexander and the whole Volcano Manor questline. A lot more in between that. The point being that there is a bunch of side stuff that the player can go ahead and do and discover, and only exists in the capacity of it being on the side. It also exists by being imperative for some endings, or for the player to fight some very good optional bosses or optional areas that exist in the game. Now, moving on to the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC or expansion section. 2 years after Elden Ring's initial release, From Software graces us with this close to masterpiece, if not masterpiece, expansion to the base game that many have said, which I can agree, is basically a whole new game. Before getting into the details, that what I will say is I think this sits atop the pecking order of DLCs along with other big masterpiece DLCs in gaming or expansions in gaming, such as Blood and Wine and Shivering Isles, with some of my favorite bosses that previously would have passed some of those in my top 5, and a great new world space to the game in the form of the Shadow Realm. It really is the size of 1/3 of the game, I think. This is far and away the best DLC I think From Software have done from just what I've played. Obviously I haven't played Bloodborne to see the old Hunters DLC, so that could be it. There's a ton of new weapons that have been added, from hand-to-hand arts to thrusting shields to light greatswords, and even more, over 100 new weapons bolstering the already large variety in builds, 3 to 4 legacy dungeons depending on how you classify them, and overall continuing and finishing up some of the threads left behind after the base game that we really didn't get to deal with. Sometimes when a DLC is made, it can be kind of a jarring addition to the game, meaning that it doesn't really feel like a natural addition or continuation to the game, and in some ways this could be nice, but others it could really hurt the DLC. For example, Fallout 3, I just did the Twittery classics on that. Operation Anchorage and Mothership Zeta are prime examples when I mean they don't really fit nicely into the base game, as the gameplay doesn't fit how I feel Fallout 3 best puts its strengths forward. Shadow of the Erdtree thankfully doesn't have this problem, despite it having the monumental task of feeling challenging to those who have had at this point 2 years to become massively overpowered level 700 characters, which even they expected to steamroll the DLC, but From Software had other ideas. Still allowed those players to have a similar experience to me, who just had a second playthrough, just integrating Shadow of the Erdtree into that new playthrough. Now, as I said, Shadow of the Erdtree's map really is large in terms of it being a DLC. We had heard beforehand that the Shadow Realm was about the size of Limgrave, which by itself is really big if you just classify Limgrave as an area on the map. From Software really went above and beyond here though, around 3 times the size of just Limgrave itself, just when you open up the map originally. One thing that could have been a worry is that how diverse the biomes and areas could be, regardless if you have a very big zone. If it's not diverse, if it's just the same zone across a whole map, it could be pretty boring, but this ended up not being an issue since we had huge different amounts of varying biomes, from Charo's Hidden Grave to the Cerulean Coast to the Gravesite Plain to the Hinterlands to the ancient ruins of Ro, and more, including the Jagged Peak and the Abyssal Woods. One thing that could have been divisive for some people is the huge amount of completely hidden areas and zones there are in the game that the player can miss unless you stumble across or actively go and find them yourself. Now this could be a pro and a con depending on who you are, because there's whole new areas like the Abyssal Woods, for example, that are behind the Minder Dungeon or the Jagged Peak as well, that are very interesting and have some good bosses for you to go and do in there and fight. But however, this would be less of an issue if the leveling system for Shadow of the Erdtree, the way you level up is the Scadutree blessing system, which allows you to get Scadutree fragments from different areas in the game and different places to basically simplify. Imagine your flask upgrades throughout the base game, which is done through the golden seeds. Every time you upgrade your Scadutree blessing, you upgrade your damage negation, which means you get less damage by enemies, and you upgrade the damage that you can inflict up to something crazy high by the end of the DLC. You're doing crazy high levels of damage if you've actually gone out and found the necessary Scadutree fragments. The issue I'm alluding to is that there's only 50 Scadutree fragments in the game, and the amount to fully upgrade the Scadutree blessing is also 50. So you actively need to go out and find every single little Scadutree fragment to get it to max. Also, these fragments can be located in completely secret areas and locations in the game, hidden behind dungeons, hidden behind locations, so it can get very annoying. This is already a solved issue in the base game of Elden Rings, with the golden seeds. There was way more golden seeds in the game, in the base game, that you needed, so if you'd missed any earlier, you could just get the maximum flasks without being forced to get out and find each one of these hidden areas, which really had the possibility of just devolving into fetch questy stuff to go to certain areas and I'll get this Scadutree fragment from this little corner of the map. I will in this section mention that the side quest lines, as there's not too many, I will say that they are pretty good for the DLC quest lines. One thing I've liked is how most of the quest lines you're going to be with one of the people that also is here to follow Mikola, almost of a fellowship of unlikely companions or of all unlikely factions, from who have followed Radahn, devout followers of Moog, to Hornset, who seeks vengeance. There are ones outside of this, barring the one in the church, are more lighter on the side content wise. They're more like Dark Souls 1, but there isn't a specific long quest line that
you go ahead and engage with. These are just NPCs that are around that you have the option to talk to and progress their stories. But I would like to point out that all of the quest lines that you follow Miquella's fellowship for, you have a time to complete them until you reach a certain point of the story, which is a very obvious point. They're simply, after that point, they all auto-fail or auto-complete. So if by the time you get to a certain point in the story, if you haven't done those in the Miquella fellowship type of area, they will all auto-fail. Now, as I said, there are 3 or 4 new legacy dungeons, and depending on how you want to classify them, 3 if you don't want to count Castle Ensis, 4 if you do, is the weakest of the new legacy dungeons regardless, as it does have a lot of the issues of the ones in the base game, such as Raya Lucina, that is short, there's not enough for what it's trying to be. But apart from that, Belurat, the Shadow Keep, and Enir Ilim are pretty good in comparison to the legacy dungeons in the base game. Belurat being on the level of like a volcano manor, as I described before. I really like it as an introductory dungeon to the DLC, kind of set the tone, have some new enemies, new bosses. It's the Shadow Keep here that I really like, with 3 distinct districts which each have different paths that route out from, like the Church District, which leads either to Commander Gaius or the Scadutree Avatar. Of course, there being Mesmer being the boss of the area, and they're also having an area lead to the ancient ruins of Ra. One of my main issues of the legacy dungeons in the base game was that they didn't feel like areas enough themselves that could stand on their own without the single important boss that was in the location. Shadow Keep does not have this issue, as I feel like it was more of an expansive and well thought out legacy dungeon that didn't just rely on Mesmer as a boss to exist. What I mean is Irithyll and Anor Londo didn't just rely on Pontiff Sullivan or Ornstein and Samo in their respective games as the sole reason of those 2 areas' existence. Now don't get me wrong, right? I'm not trying to say that there haven't been areas like that in those previous games that do just rely on the boss's existence. That doesn't mean that they're good just because they exist in those previous games. With legacy dungeons, what I like that they do and what they intend to do in my eyes is capture the feeling of going through some of those areas that existed in previous Souls games. Again, what I'm saying is that they did do a great job with the Shadow Keep in this regard, and of course there is the argument that density and complexity over just sheer size matters in Souls games, and I can agree with that because there isn't any real bad legacy dungeons in the base game. Even Raya Lucina Academy, which in my opinion was one of the weaker ones, had a lot of depth in it in terms of going around to the different pillars and a few quest lines and a few hidden areas. What I'm just saying is that I prefer the Shadow Keep style where there's a lot to it, and I do think the Shadow Keep is the best legacy dungeon they've made in Elden Ring, both in the base game and the DLC, but that's my opinion. Now onto the bosses. Now I do want to be more conscious of spoilers, since if you're watching this, you haven't beat the DLC or done at least the majority of it, or you don't want to have stuff spoiled for you, just skip to the conclusion regardless of what I'm going to say here. Now I think Shadow of the Erdtree does have some amazing bosses, some difficult bosses, and some copy paste style bosses which existed in the base game of Elden Ring too, but I still don't like. I don't like how you fight the Ghost Flame Dragon like 3 times as 3 separate bosses with no difference between them. To have the base game dragons as separate fights, and then to have an ancient dragon from the base game as another fight, I didn't really like it too much. That's where most of the negatives for me end though, as the actual bosses, as in the important bosses with remembrances, were all really good. From Midra to Baal to Mesmer to Commander Gaius and the Erdtree Avatar. What I can really appreciate is it felt like every boss or every important boss in the DLC could have been the final boss of a DLC and not be a bad boss to end the DLC. I thought the Dancing Lion was a great introductory boss to get people back in the swing of Elden Ring after a few years. R'hllana was definitely one of my favorites, from her cool factor to the frantic second phase of the Twin Moons. Mesmer I would have put in my top 5 as a boss. If I had counted it in the DLC early, I would have definitely put Mesmer in my top 5, at least replacing Godric as number 5. But in general, his second phase with the 2 dual undead snakes and the lore surrounding him as the lost child or the hidden child, and he got sent away to do this dishonorable crusade and massacre all these Hornsent that you see in Belurat, which is why the Shadow Realm appears the way it appears. And of course, fight itself for me, I don't particularly think he was a cheap boss in any ways, apart from maybe dual snakes and attack, which did end up being the biggest obstacle for me. But apart from that, he really does feel like a fair fight that you can master when it just clicks to you. Then there is Romina, Saint of the Bud, which I do think is the weakest out of the required boss. In general, I don't like Scarlet Rot or any type of poison mechanic being integrated as a main mechanic in a fight, and especially with this, but that isn't my main gripe with it. I really didn't like the hitboxes. For someone who went through with a great sword strength build, there was many times where I hit her, but she didn't take damage. Aesthetically, I liked the fight, but I just wish it was treated better or more important, maybe with a cutscene scene to make me remember or care more about it on the presentation level as well. Before we get to the final fight, I do want to talk about some important side remembrance bosses that were pretty good, and I want to give my thoughts on them. Bale the Dread was probably one of the better dragon bosses they've designed in a while, and the only things I really have to say I didn't like was two things. Don't like it when my screen is just overloaded with just so many attacks and I can't tell what's going on, and I really don't like how you can only target its head. I think the camera is the main issue in this fight, and combining the fact that especially in his second phase he does a bunch of stuff that covers the screen and you can't really see him most of the time, it just made me just want to summon Igon and just get the fight over with, which was a thing when it happened. Now then there's Midra in Midra's Manse. If you want to call that a legacy dungeon as well, but I really think it would be more of a minor one like Castle Sol or Castle Moon in the game. Midra was a cool boss when he became the Lord of Frenzied Flame, and like what happens to you in the Lord of the Frenzied Flame ending, it was really good presentation wise, and I really liked the fight. For me at least, it wasn't too difficult. I got it down first try. So then there was the Putrescent Knight, I think that is how you say it, which was a challenge. It took me a while to get it down because, as I was saying, I was using a great sword and his hitbox is less than optimal, but apart from that, I like how aggressive this boss is. The only thing I don't like is the big sludge fire thing that he floats up and he does 3 rounds of fire. For me, I just couldn't get that down perfectly, and it was a very RNG thing if I would dodge it or not. Commander Gaius I thought was more of a cheap fight, and I don't like how they changed his starting position after the first time you fight him to being looking straight at you, even though he's mounted, and it's one of the only fights you can do mounted. I just found doing it mounted was a waste of time to try. He does do way too much damage and way too much bullshit attacks for you to do it mounted and not being able to dodge, in my experience. But I thought ultimately his ended up being an alright one in terms of aesthetics. Then there's the Erdtree avatar, which I think is the weakest fight in the DLC from a general standpoint. It's cool in a way. For me, it was just a race, kill it 3 times until it died. Mother Meteor was a alright fight. What I don't like about it is trivial. I just don't like when bosses summon smaller enemies to come at you mid-fight. I just ended up ignoring them and just kept attacking her, but it was a small gripe. I thought overall it was just one of the more okay fights over being amazing or top tier. The lore around the fight is pretty cool, but without further ado, let's talk about the final boss. Now, I know a lot of people have had an issue in the past about Radahn being the final boss, and I get it. For me, as I've said, Radahn was my favorite in the base game, so I may be biased in saying that I didn't have as big as an issue as other people did. I did get spoiled that he was the final boss thanks to Twitter. Now, is Promised Consort Radahn as hard as everyone's making him out to be? This is obviously talking about, I don't know about now, by the way, so sorry to interject. This was done pre-nerf, and I know they've nerfed him since then. Was he as difficult as people was talking about him as? Yes, I think he may have been the most difficult, hardest fight they've ever put together for From Software I've ever put. It took me 3 days to get down in comparison to every other boss taking me maximum a day. I will also say that I summoned for this fight from the beginning, as I felt it was going to be an absolute nightmare to get down, so that's 3 days of fighting with summoning. The only boss that took me the 3 days, my very first time, is getting Melania down in my first playthrough, and I did that without summons. So Promised Consort Radahn taking 3 days with summons just tells you about the difficulty. So it blows out every other tier in terms of difficulty, which could be good or bad depending on what you consider important. I'm not one of those people who think that a fight has to be hard to be good and vice versa. An easy fight can't be good. I think overall I like the first phase of this fight more. It felt like a more natural form of difficulty. I like how he basically picks you apart in terms of if you're not good enough, you'll be destroyed very easily in the first phase. And then the second phase is a bit more iffy for me. As I said for Bale, I really don't like it when I can't see what's going on the screen. And basically in this fight is a whole bunch of explosions and death rays that have the potential to lead to a death and restart. Radahn's second phase isn't too different from the first, apart from every attack he does having a mini explosion added that can really mess you up. His meteor attack, which I just couldn't read, again an RNG focused thing where depending on where I decided to stand, it would kill me or not. Then there's the explosion attack that is added if you're better off just blocking and then instead of just trying to run. Overall, I thought it was great in presentation. I loved the first phase and the lore behind it was great as well. Would I have preferred a different absolute final boss? I like this fight in general, but maybe Godwyn in some form to tie up that loose end might have been a better fight, but I can't tell, since there's a bunch of factors that would influence how I would rate the outcome to this, and compared to this one, I thought Radahn's soul in Mohg's body, which had basically been mutilated to look like Radahn, be a suitable vessel for Radahn to basically become as close as possible to Prime Radahn as we can get to. It answered a decent number of questions as to why Malenia and Radahn were fighting in the first place. One of the first things we saw in terms of Elden Ring, you know, the marketing material in the first trailer, we see them fighting, and we see it in the story trailer as well. Now we know that Miquella sent Malenia to kill Radahn because Radahn refused to be Miquella's consort, so he wanted to use his soul to basically force him to. Overall though, I think the bosses are a highlight of the DLC, and From Software really did a great job in all the bosses. Okay, now on to the conclusion. Now, is Elden Ring a worth it experience to get into? You don't need me to tell you that it's yes. Of course it is. From Software Souls games have never been more accessible and flexible than they made it in Elden Ring, with all the things that you can do to vary the difficulty and experience. Even if you are someone who never got into Souls or never really liked them, outside of hating them, if you hate them, and obviously no matter how much more flexible they make it, you're still not going to like it since it's a Souls game. Anyway, just to give you a measure of how long each playthrough took me, how many hours someone could look forward to with Elden Ring, my first blind playthrough of the game took me 99 hours to beat, doing a lot of the side content. Now, I did miss some side content in the first playthrough because at that time there wasn't full knowledge of Questlines, which weren't fully discovered and all that kind of stuff, since I did it all the way back when it came out originally, and I didn't want to really look into the game or the guide. But my second playthrough, doing a lot of the content, took me 65 hours of the base game. The DLC then bumped that up to 108 hours, which is a very sizable amount that the game is to purchase, and just counting 2 playthroughs, not focusing on co-op or PvP, which can really prolong your experience in Souls games. There's a lot of things for you to go ahead and try and do, and keep going for different playthroughs to keep the game fresh when you do go back into it. The DLC also was a very worthwhile experience. By extension, it did add another 40 hours to my playthrough, but to be fair, half of those were spent on the final boss. But still, for those who like From Software's DLC, it's either one of the best ones they've made or the best one they've made. I can't speak on Bloodborne's DLC, but I can at least say from Dark Souls DLC, from a content standpoint, if you consider what you get and the quality, Shadow of the Erdtree is the best for me. Now, sentiment and nostalgia can, you know, make people think, okay, Artorias DLC and all that kind of stuff, and the Ringed City definitely could be up there, and that's absolutely fine. I'm just giving my opinion. Shadow of the Erdtree I think is best that they've done that I can verify. Since this is a pretty long review, I can't really give pros and cons. This is essentially 2 extensive reviews in one, so I'll just add the rating for both the Elden Ring and Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree review, so you can just get done with this. If you watched all the way, I can't thank you enough. If you enjoyed the video, please leave some constructive feedback in the comments, like, subscribe, it really helps out. Just to set some ground rules for those who haven't watched one of my reviews before, I give game scores differently from how others might. I don't have the belief that you can have a universal score for games that games can all be rated by. If I do choose to give a score, it will have to be games that are or will be a part of a franchise or series of games, and the score will be in context of that series of games or how well it fulfills its ultimate potential. For example, I might give Dark Souls 1 a 9.3, and I might give Dark Souls 2 a 7.1. Now, that doesn't mean I think Dark Souls 2 is a 7 in comparison to other games. I just think it's a 7 in terms of its full potential. It's all subjective, and ultimately you can disagree with my score, and that's absolutely fine, but ultimately it's how I like to review things, and I typically don't give 10 out of 10s very often at all, as the more I love something, the more critical I may sound or may be of it. So if I don't give a game 10 out of 10, there's nothing against the game actually being a 10 out of 10 in anyone's eyes. So now onto the scores. I would give Elden Ring, just the base game, a 9.7. A very high score. I consider it being one of the best games ever made. It's a masterpiece, but even Miyazaki said Elden Ring was close to the ultimate game, but it wasn't quite there. So if he thinks that he can do better than Elden Ring, I want to allow for some room for them to actually get that pinnacle. Also, outside of smaller criticism and issue I have had of the game as well, that did hold it back a bit. So that's the Elden Ring base game, and the DLC isn't far behind. I would rate Shadow of the Erdtree a 9.6, which is really high for me to give a DLC or expansion. There's only a few other DLCs that can even be said in the same breath, this kind of pinnacle score. This is also rank taken into account. It's a DLC and it isn't meant to be a full game, but regardless, it provides a lot of content that can really be considered its own game. As I said, there's a few more criticisms I levied towards Shadow of the Erdtree in comparison to even the base game, in terms of the Scadutree fragments and the blessing system, which could be perfected more. To be clear, by the way, I don't believe the Scadutree blessing system is bad. I believe it has actually a lot of potential to be a
base of how From Software does progression in the DLCs to be then iterated upon in future games. There is criticism around the final boss, which personally didn't actually affect my score, but there is other criticisms about the open world of the expansion. Despite it being beautiful and expansive, it's not as densely populated with things to do as even the base game was, and I can see that as a fair critique, but again, I didn't personally hold that against the expansion too much, as it is meant to be a full game. So overall, they did a good job of the DLC, with some things being better than the base game, but naturally some things are going to be worse, such as the questlines not being as extensive and feeling more like Dark Souls 1 questlines than they were in Elden Ring, which were more extensive with their own bosses, whole new areas, etc. But again, that's the end of the review. It's been a very, very long review. The recording time on this is 2 hours, unedited, so obviously I'll edit this down. But thank you guys for watching. This is a 20-page review. Thank you guys so much. This is something that one of my favorite games. I've always wanted to review it. Now, if you like the review, please consider subscribing for more content. I stream basically every day. Right now, at the time of recording, we've just got to chapter 6 of Red Dead Redemption 2. So if you guys want to consider liking if you like the video, leave a comment. Please leave some feedback in the comments for what I can do. Apologies if I sound a bit low. I want to keep it down since I have people visiting over at the moment. Apologies. I hope I sound good actually. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and see you guys in the next video. Bye bye.